The Vatican has survived crusades, schisms, Napoleon, and 2 world wars, and it has done all of that while officially owning very little in the way of escape routes. Beneath the marble and incense and 2,000 years of accumulated spiritual authority, there are rumors of something else entirely: reinforced concrete, emergency power, corridors that don't appear on any public blueprint, humming quietly beneath the sound of choir practice like a secret the stone itself is trying to keep. An institution that preaches surrender to divine providence apparently spent considerable resources engineering a very material exit strategy, not against God, but against the kind of men who show up with tanks and don't care about encyclicals. But why would the headquarters of faith, the place that tells 1 billion people to trust in something greater than themselves, quietly build one of the most sophisticated continuity plans in European geopolitics, and then spend decades insisting it doesn't exist? Somewhere beneath the Sistine Chapel, if you believe the engineers who won't give their names and the archivists who speak only in retirement, there is a hum. Not the hum of prayer. Not the hum of 2,000 years of accumulated holiness vibrating through travertine stone. Something more mechanical, more deliberate. The kind of hum that requires fuel and maintenance schedules and people who sign non-disclosure agreements before they pick up a wrench. Welcome to Vatican City. Population 800. Square footage 110 acres. Number of officially confirmed underground bunkers 0. Isn't that cozy? The Vatican is, by almost any measure, the most serene-looking institution on Earth. The piazza opens its arms like a grandfather. The fountains murmur. The marble catches the Roman afternoon light in a way that seems almost engineered to make you forget that this place has survived the fall of Rome, the Black Death, the Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars, and roughly 45 assassination attempts on various popes, give or take. It radiates permanence, divine permanence. The kind that doesn't need a backup generator because God, presumably, does not experience power outages. And yet, people who work in the deeper administrative corridors of the Vatican, the ones that smell of cold stone and old paper and something faintly mineral, the ones where the air carries a pressure that isn't quite right for a building that old, these people occasionally describe something underfoot. A vibration. Subtle, rhythmic, not architectural. The kind that comes from machinery doing something continuous and important in a place that wasn't built to have machinery. Here is the rhetorical contradiction at the heart of this story. An institution whose entire theological project is the promise of eternity, whose public posture is one of absolute spiritual confidence, has spent considerable effort and presumably considerable money preparing for very specific, very earthly catastrophes, emergency communications, hardened infrastructure, continuity of institution planning that would make a Cold War general feel seen. You don't install a generator under a chapel because you trust in divine providence. You install it because you've done the math. And the Vatican has always done the math. 20 centuries of institutional survival doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone in every generation sat down and asked the unglamorous question, what happens if the worst occurs? What do we need to keep going? What needs to be underground? And how deep? And who needs to know? The Church offers answers to the eternal questions with great confidence. Where do we come from? What happens when we die? What is the nature of the divine? These they will discuss at length in Latin with footnotes. Ask them about the subterranean infrastructure beneath the Apostolic Palace, and the conversation becomes remarkably brief. So, what does the world's oldest continuous institution think it needs to survive? And why exactly won't it say so? That question has a history. And like most histories worth telling, it starts with a catastrophe that nobody saw coming and a very small group of people who, quietly, absolutely did. The Lateran Treaty was signed on February 11th, 1929, in a room full of men who each believed they were getting the better deal. On one side, Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, representing a church that had spent 59 years without a country. On the other, Benito Mussolini, representing a fascist government that wanted the Vatican's moral credibility more than it wanted its 121 acres. They shook hands. They smiled. And just like that, Vatican City became a sovereign nation, the smallest in the world, with a legal status so peculiar that international lawyers still argue about it at conferences, presumably with small glasses of wine and increasing frustration. Here is the irony worth sitting with. The independence of the Holy See, that ancient spiritual authority from which the entire institutional weight of Catholicism flows, rests on a document negotiated with a man who would, within a decade, be hanging upside down from a gas station in Milan. Modern Vatican sovereignty is, legally speaking, a fascist gift. The Church has made its peace with this. It had to. The alternatives were worse. Now consider what that sovereignty sits on top of. Physically, geologically, architecturally. St. Peter's Basilica, which took 120 years to build and contains enough marble to make your eyes water. The Apostolic Palace, where 1,000 years of papal administration has left paper trails in 17 languages. The gardens, manicured and quiet in a way that feels almost aggressive. Beneath all of that, the grottos. Beneath the grottos, the necropolis, an ancient Roman cemetery where excavators in the 1940s found what they believed to be the tomb of Peter himself. The Vatican is not just old. It is layered stratum upon stratum, each era building directly on top of the last, which means whatever infrastructure exists below ground shares space with 2 millennia of accumulated humanity. And protecting all of this in the military sense is a force of roughly 135 Swiss guards, most of whom are under 30 and some of whom are currently holding halberds. Beautiful halberds. Very well-maintained halberds. Weapons that were cutting edge in the early 1500s and have since been surpassed, modestly, by most subsequent developments in armed conflict. This is the core vulnerability. 121 acres. No standing army. No air defense. A location in the middle of a major European capital with no buffer zone to speak of, surrounded by a city of nearly 3 million people. The world's most spiritually significant address is also, by conventional military logic, almost entirely indefensible. Which raises a serious question about what, exactly, they've been quietly building below it. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in a corridor so narrow that archaeologists had to excavate it by hand, workers in 1942 uncovered a city of the dead that predated Christianity entirely. The Vatican necropolis had been sitting there since the 1st century, a dense neighborhood of mausoleums packed with pagans and early Christians alike, their bones undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. They found frescoes still bearing color, mosaic floors, terracotta pipes for funeral offerings. And deeper still, beneath layers of earth and rubble deliberately packed by Emperor Constantine's builders in the 300s, something that looked very much like a grave marked with the name Petros, Peter. The whole project had been ordered by Pope Pius XII during wartime, with minimal announcement, conducted quietly beneath a basilica that 5 million tourists walk through every year. Nobody mentioned it publicly until 1950. This is a pattern worth noticing. The Vatican has a long, comfortable relationship with the idea of things being below ground and nobody talking about them. Consider the Passetto di Borgo. It is 800 meters of elevated stone corridor running directly from the Vatican walls to Castel Sant'Angelo, the hulking circular fortress that squats on the Tiber like a disagreeable uncle. The passage was reinforced in the late 1500s, but the infrastructure existed earlier, and its most famous use came in 1527 when Pope Clement VII, in velvet robes with nowhere particular to go, fled down it while Spanish and German mercenaries were busy sacking Rome below. He watched his city burn from the ramparts of Sant'Angelo. He survived. The corridor worked. This was not improvised. Someone had built that passage, maintained it, stocked the fortress at the other end, and ensured that when catastrophe arrived, the institution had a way out. That is not crisis management. That is architecture expressing a philosophy. The philosophy being, we have been here before. We will be here again. Build accordingly. Every generation of Vatican administration has inherited this mindset and, apparently, honored it. Crypts beneath crypts. Escape routes adjacent to processional routes. The sacred and the strategic have never, in this particular geography, been truly separable. Holy ground has always been hollow ground because holiness, historically, needs somewhere to go when things get bad. Which brings us to the 20th century, to reinforced concrete, to a Cold War that made every government on Earth reconsider what it meant to survive, and to the question of what an institution with 2,000 years of underground infrastructure experience might have quietly decided to build next. By 1958, the United States government had spent roughly $2 billion quietly honeycombing the Appalachian Mountains with reinforced concrete. Project Greek Island, Raven Rock, Mount Weather. Eisenhower's continuity of government program operated on a simple, grim premise. The presidency had to survive a nuclear exchange, and survival required preparation that the public would find, at minimum, unsettling. So they built in secret, labeled the budgets creatively, and told almost nobody. The British had their own version beneath a Wiltshire hillside. The Swiss had gone further still, mandating by law that every new building include a blast-resistant shelter. An entire nation quietly deciding that civilization required a basement. Rome, meanwhile, was sitting at an extremely inconvenient geopolitical address. Italy had joined NATO in 1949, and American military installations had spread across its territory like a very politely arranged occupation. Aviano, Camp Darby, naval facilities at Gaeta. From Moscow's perspective, Rome was not a holy city. It was a logistics hub for the Western Alliance, and Soviet nuclear targeting lists from the period, partially declassified decades later, confirmed that Rome was considered a high-priority strike candidate. A city of 3 million people and an American ally. Also, technically, the administrative center of the world's largest religious institution. Those two facts were uncomfortable neighbors. The Vatican, at this point, covered just over 100 acres and housed roughly 800 permanent residents. It had its own radio station, its own postal system, its own newspaper. It did not officially have a bomb shelter. But something was happening underground during the late 1950s. Construction workers and contractors operating within Vatican City during the final years of Pius XII's pontificate described excavation projects they were instructed not to discuss. Unexplained earthworks near the Governorate building. Deep foundation work that seemed excessive for whatever structure it supposedly supported. Pius died in October 1958, and his successor John XXIII arrived to find, among other things, an institution with fresh concrete somewhere beneath it and no official documentation explaining why. The theological problem here is genuinely delightful in a purely academic way. A pope who builds a nuclear bunker is a pope who is hedging. The entire public message of Catholic leadership during the Cold War, articulated beautifully by John XXIII in his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, was that nuclear weapons represented a moral catastrophe, that peace required trust, that humanity could not bomb its way to safety. These are not the sentiments of an institution that simultaneously has a ventilated underground chamber stocked for emergencies. The left hand, it seems, did not always brief the right hand on its architectural decisions. Every government that built a bunker faced a version of this contradiction. Democracy requires surviving leaders to remain democratic. Faith requires trust in God, unless you can also pour reinforced concrete. Institutions, whatever their stated values, have a powerful instinct for self-preservation that tends to express itself in exactly the same way. Quietly, underground, without a press release. The question now becomes who exactly was expected to shelter inside. Concrete does not lie. It sits where it was poured, holds what was built on top of it, and keeps its mouth shut forever. The men who poured it, however, are somewhat less reliable. Between roughly 1958 and 1972, several Italian construction firms were reportedly brought inside Vatican walls for reinforced underground work. The firms themselves are not publicly named in any confirmed document. What circulates instead is the shape of the arrangement. Specialist contractors, technical crews cleared for sensitive work, and agreements described by those familiar with Italian industrial practice as having the warm, collegial tone of sign this, forget this, go home. Non-disclosure agreements existed long before anyone called them that. In post-war Italy, where the government, the church, and American intelligence had developed an unusually cozy triangle of overlapping interests, keeping a work crew quiet was not considered a complicated problem. The logistics, though. That is where the story gets genuinely difficult to swallow in the most interesting way. Vatican City covers 121 acres. It is surrounded by walls, monitored by its own security, and embedded in the middle of a city that contains journalists, diplomats, historians, and approximately 4 centuries of people professionally dedicated to watching everything the papacy does. Moving thousands of tons of concrete and steel into that environment without creating a visible record requires either extraordinary coordination or extraordinary luck. Probably some of both, and almost certainly some creative accounting in the Vatican's own opaque procurement records, which are not to the surprise of absolutely no one publicly available. What researchers have noted are procurement anomalies in Vatican spending during this period, categories of expenditure that do not obviously correspond to any documented construction project above ground. Declassified American intelligence files from the 1960s contain what analysts politely call oblique references. Cables referencing Vatican emergency infrastructure. Memos noting, in the careful language of people who are aware they are creating a permanent record, that the Holy See had taken steps consistent with continuity planning. Italian intelligence files from the same period, portions of which became accessible after various declassification processes in the 1990s, echo the same vague, careful language. Nobody says bunker. Everybody seems to know something is there. Then there are the people who walk the corridors. Swiss guards and Vatican maintenance staff, speaking privately over the decades, have described passages and rooms that do not appear on any public architectural map of Vatican City. Retired Curia officials, in interviews that tend to happen late in life when the instinct for discretion softens slightly, have mentioned descending to levels of certain buildings where the air felt different, pressurized differently, where the doors were heavier than the rooms behind them seemed to require. None of these accounts are sworn testimony. None come with photographs. They are the accumulated whispers of people who worked inside an institution that is, structurally and theologically, extremely good at keeping secrets. Which brings us to the necessary and honest caveat. No photograph of a Vatican bunker has been publicly confirmed. No floor plan. No internal document with a header that reads in reassuringly plain language, Vatican emergency shelter, capacity, provisions, location. The Vatican's official position on the subject is something researchers have described as studied silence, which is distinct from denial and considerably more interesting than either confirmation or dismissal. Studied silence is an institution saying, with great dignity and no words at all, we are not discussing this, and your continued questions are noted. The absence of proof is not proof of absence, but it is also not proof of anything else. What the evidence actually supports is a more modest and perhaps more fascinating conclusion. That something was built, that people who built it were encouraged not to remember it, and that the institution above it has spent 60 years demonstrating a commitment to institutional memory that is, in the specific case of underground infrastructure, surprisingly selective. What the contractors whispered, it seems, stayed whispered. What remains is the harder question, not whether something exists beneath those walls, but who, in the event of a catastrophe, was ever meant to walk down into it. That answer, as it turns out, involves a list that was never officially written down either. 85 kilometers of shelving. Stack that end to end and you have a corridor running from Vatican City to the outskirts of Naples, lined floor to ceiling with papal correspondence, Inquisition transcripts, diplomatic letters from Henry VIII, records of excommunications, annulments, canonizations, and the occasional letter from a king who desperately needed a favor and was willing to be very, very nice about asking. The Vatican's secret archives, which are not actually secret in the conspiratorial sense but are very much restricted in the practical sense, represent over 12 centuries of institutional memory. If you were designing a catastrophe plan for an organization that believes it will exist until the end of time, the question of what to protect first is not a small one. So imagine being the person who has to make that list. The art presents an immediate problem that is almost funny in its intractability. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted between 1508 and 1512, weighs several hundred tons and is attached to a building. It is not going anywhere. Whatever emergency infrastructure exists beneath Vatican City, Michelangelo stays upstairs with the problem. But the portable works, the reliquaries, the illuminated manuscripts, the Raphael sketches, the objects small enough to carry and significant enough that losing them would represent an irreplaceable wound to human civilization, those are a different calculation entirely. Institutions that have survived long enough develop a very specific instinct for what fits in a crate. Then there is the money, which requires a somewhat more careful conversation. The Vatican Bank, formerly the Institute for the Works of Religion, has operated since 1942 in a manner that external auditors have historically described as creative. Its gold reserves, its accumulated holdings, the centuries of donated wealth that sits somewhere between charitable trust and sovereign treasury, these represent the financial continuity of an institution that considers itself permanent. Any serious continuity plan addresses liquidity. Any serious institution protects its ability to function on the other side of a catastrophe. The fact that the Vatican's financial records are not public is, at this point, less a revelation than a recurring theme. But here is where the theology gets genuinely interesting. Catholic doctrine holds that the papacy is indestructible as an institution. The Pope as a person is mortal, fallible, and theologically distinct from the office he holds. Which means a bunker designed to protect the papacy does not necessarily need to protect the Pope. It needs to protect the capacity to elect a successor, to maintain apostolic succession, to keep the machinery of a 2,000-year-old institution operational. The archives matter more than the man in a very specific doctrinal sense. The gold funds the continuation. The portable art represents legitimacy. The person is, in the kindest possible theological framing, temporary. Which tells you something, if you are paying attention. What an institution chooses to protect in extremis is a more honest statement of its values than any document it has ever published. Strip away the public rhetoric, the pastoral letters, the carefully managed press releases, and you are left with a list. A quiet, unofficial, never formally written list of what cannot be lost. The question of who made that list, and when, and what exactly is on it, leads somewhere that no official source has ever been willing to confirm. At 12:17 in the afternoon on May 13, 1981, a young Turkish man named Mehmet Ali Aka pushed through a crowd of approximately 20,000 people in St. Peter's Square and fired 2 shots at Pope John Paul II. The square was warm. It was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays meant the general audience, which meant pilgrims and tourists packed shoulder to shoulder in the sun, waving and calling out as the white Pope mobile moved slowly through the crowd. The noise was celebratory. Then it wasn't. The Pope slumped. Blood spread across the white of his vestments, a detail so visually stark that witnesses described it in almost exactly the same words years later when they tried to explain what they had seen. Aka was tackled within seconds, partly by police and partly by the crowd itself, which is the sort of spontaneous justice that happens when you attempt something monstrous in front of 20,000 people who were, moments before, feeling quite spiritually elevated. John Paul II survived, after 5 hours of surgery and a recovery that he later attributed to the intercession of Our Lady of Fatima, whose feast day, as he noted with feeling, fell on May 13th. The Vatican's security apparatus drew its own conclusions, and they were considerably less mystical. What followed was a quiet institutional reckoning of the sort that rarely makes headlines because it is designed not to. Hardened vehicles replaced open-air ones. New protocols emerged governing papal movement, crowd access, and the layered cooperation between Vatican security and Italian law enforcement. The Popemobile acquired bulletproof glass, which is a sentence that should not need to exist but very much does. And reportedly, in the discussions that took place well below the level of press releases, attention turned to the facilities underground. Because here was the problem that May 13th made impossible to ignore. The papacy had spent decades modeling existential threats in terms of nuclear war, superpower collapse, civilizational catastrophe. Large, slow-moving threats that gave you time to prepare. Akka walked up and fired a handgun. The threat had been human-scaled, fast, and almost successful. The institution that considered itself eternal had nearly lost its leader to a man with a pistol on a Wednesday afternoon. The theology had always maintained that the office was indestructible, even if the man was not. But there is a meaningful difference between doctrine and operational reality, and the operational reality in 1981 was that the Vatican's physical security had not kept pace with a world increasingly shaped by terrorism, asymmetric conflict, and the particular chaos of ideologically motivated individuals. Upgrading underground facilities, in that context, stopped looking like extravagance and started looking like responsibility. Nobody needed to explain it. Nobody needed to defend it publicly. John Paul II's blood on the stones of St. Peter's Square had provided all the institutional cover required. It is quietly useful in matters of security spending to have had a near catastrophe. It converts hypothetical arguments into settled ones. The bunker question, whatever its exact dimensions, had shifted from should we to we already should have. What remained, as always, was the question of what exactly had been built, and where, and what it was designed to survive. On the morning of September 12, 2001, St. Peter's Square was empty. Not quiet. Not subdued. Empty. The cobblestones that normally held tens of thousands of visitors by mid-morning held, instead, barriers and silence and the particular stillness of a place where something has been decided very quickly by people who do not explain their decisions to the public. The fountains still ran. Nobody was there to hear them. The previous day, 2 commercial aircraft had brought down the World Trade Center, a third had struck the Pentagon, and a fourth had gone into a Pennsylvania field after passengers overwhelmed the hijackers. Within hours, security services across the Western world were running threat assessments on symbolic targets. The Vatican, being simultaneously a religious headquarters, a sovereign state, a global media presence, and arguably the most recognizable address in Christendom, appeared on those lists without anyone needing to argue the point. The closure of St. Peter's Square on September 12th was announced with the language of precaution. It was, in institutional terms, extraordinary. The square has hosted plague years, world wars, and the assassination attempt you heard about in the last chapter. The Vatican closing its most public face to the world is roughly equivalent to the British Crown boarding up Buckingham Palace. It signals something that the official language is specifically designed not to say. Pope John Paul II, who was 71 and in declining health by this point, made a brief public appearance to pray and express condolences. Then the official record becomes, as records so often do in Vatican affairs, decoratively incomplete. Where he spent the remainder of that tense September day is not specified in any document the Holy See has released. Where senior Curia members were relocated during the emergency hours is similarly unaddressed. The official accounts mention security coordination with Italian authorities, appropriate precautions, and a return to normal operations. They do not mention rooms. This is, depending on your generosity of spirit, either entirely reasonable operational security or a remarkably consistent absence of detail. What Rome's neighboring residents did notice in the months and years that followed was construction, not the decorative kind. Steel barriers appeared around Vatican City's perimeter, replacing older, more ceremonial arrangements with ones that could stop a vehicle traveling at speed. Blast-resistant installations went in quietly. And underground, according to accounts from residents in Borgo and Prati, the tunneling sounds that had occasionally surfaced as neighborhood gossip in earlier decades became, for a period after 2001, rather more frequent and rather less deniable. The post-September 11th security paradigm changed institutions worldwide. Airports, government buildings, financial centers all emerged from the following years looking harder, more fortified, more honestly aware of what the world had demonstrated it was capable of. The Vatican was not exempt from this reckoning. It simply conducted its version with its characteristic preference for doing things without holding a press conference about them. What the square's closure revealed, briefly and against the institution's usual habits, was that the Holy See had begun thinking of itself as something that could be targeted. Not in the theological sense, in the logistical one. That admission, however carefully managed, raises a question the Vatican has never quite answered. If you build a place safe enough to shelter the papacy during an emergency, what, precisely, does it look like inside? Beneath a luxury resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, behind a wall panel in what guests knew as the exhibition hall, sat 100,000 square feet of reinforced concrete that the United States government maintained, stocked and staffed for nearly 3 decades without the hotel's own visitors noticing. The Greenbrier bunker, built in the late 1950s and decommissioned only after a journalist exposed it in 1992, was designed to house the entire United States Congress during nuclear war. The chandeliers upstairs. The survival pods downstairs. Room service and annihilation separated by an elevator. The Vatican, it turns out, has company. America's continuity of government infrastructure reads like a real estate portfolio assembled by someone with very specific anxieties. Mount Weather in Virginia. Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania. The Greenbrier. Each one built on the same philosophy. The institution is more important than the building it currently occupies, and the institution must survive what the building cannot. The language differs between a democratic republic and an apostolic see. The architecture, remarkably, does not. Russia took a more ambitious approach, because Russia generally does. The alleged Metro 2 system beneath Moscow, a parallel subway network running deeper than the public lines and connecting the Kremlin to key government facilities, has been acknowledged by precisely nobody in any official Russian document. Former KGB officers have mentioned it. Satellite imaging suggests it. A Moscow Civil Defense Department head confirmed its existence in 1981, and then apparently reconsidered. The Russian government's official position is approximately the same as the Vatican's, which is to say, a very confident silence. Then there is the newer cohort. Peter Thiel holds New Zealand residency and a compound that requires no particular imagination to interpret. Silicon Valley's prepper movement has converted former missile silos in Kansas into survival condos, selling units for upward of $3 million each. These are not paranoid outliers. These are people who helped build the digital architecture of modern civilization and have apparently concluded they know something about its structural integrity that the rest of us should find concerning. The pattern across centuries and continents and ideologies is identical. Every institution that believes it is indispensable eventually builds a room nobody is supposed to know about. The United States built several. Russia built a subway line. Billionaires built a neighborhood. The Vatican simply built its version first, in an era when the stones were still being laid around it, and has had considerably longer to perfect the art of not discussing it. Which brings us, finally, to the question worth asking. What exactly would the Vatican be trying to preserve? In 1992, a Vatican spokesperson was asked directly whether the Holy See maintained any form of protected underground continuity facility. The response, preserved in the journalist's notes, was 4 sentences long and contained no answer whatsoever. This is genuinely an art form. The Vatican has been practicing strategic silence since before most modern nations existed as concepts. When Galileo published his defense of heliocentrism in 1632, the Church did not panic publicly. It processed. It deliberated. It issued its position with the unhurried confidence of an institution that does not feel the pressure of a news cycle, because in 1632 there was no news cycle, and in the Vatican's deeper institutional memory, there still isn't. The formal apology for that particular episode arrived in 1992. 359 years is a long time to think about your answer, but the Vatican has never seemed embarrassed by the timeline. That same temperament applies, with remarkable consistency, to bunker questions. Journalists who have pressed Vatican communications offices on the subject report a recognizable experience. The spokesperson listens. They may even nod. Then they produce something that sounds grammatically like an answer but contains, upon examination, zero information. No confirmation. No denial. A gentle reference to the Vatican's commitment to its spiritual mission. Perhaps a comment about how the Holy Father's safety is always a priority, phrased in a way that implies no specific mechanism ensures it. The conversation ends. Everyone goes home. Nothing has been said. This is not evasion from embarrassment. It is evasion from logic. Confirming a bunker's existence tells any interested party that there is something worth finding. It invites questions about location, capacity, access routes, and supply chains. It converts a rumor into a target. Denying it, on the other hand, invites exactly the kind of investigative pressure that exposed the Greenbrier after 30 years of successful concealment. The Washington Post reporter who broke that story noted that once he started asking, people started checking. A flat denial is an instruction to dig. Silence, by contrast, provides nothing to verify and nothing to contradict. It is the rhetorical equivalent of a sealed room. The theological dimension here is genuinely interesting, in the way that watching someone balance on a very narrow ledge is interesting. The Vatican's spiritual authority rests partly on the idea that its concerns are not of this world. Bunkers are extremely of this world. They are concrete and ventilation shafts and freeze-dried provisions and backup generators. They are the most material possible response to fear. Admitting to one means admitting that the institution responsible for consoling humanity in the face of death has made certain arrangements, just in case. The comparison to other governments is instructive. American officials asked about Mount Weather have used nearly identical language to Vatican spokespersons asked about underground facilities. Russian officials discussing Metro 2 produced the same comfortable fog. The phrasing differs. The structure does not. Every institution that has built a room it cannot acknowledge has independently arrived at the same communication strategy, which suggests the strategy is simply correct. The silence confirms the bunker. The bunker required the silence. The circle closes neatly. What remains is the harder question: what exactly lives inside it? There is a prayer attributed to Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century that contains one of the most honestly human lines in theological history. "Lord, make me chaste," he reportedly wrote, "but not yet." Augustine understood something the Vatican has never quite managed to say out loud. The gap between what we believe and what we do when we are genuinely frightened is not hypocrisy. It is just being alive. Consider the theological problem honestly. Catholic doctrine holds that divine providence governs all things. That God sustains the church not because of her buildings or her archives or her pope, but because of a promise that predates any of those things. The gates of hell and all that. If you believe that promise absolutely, then a bunker is not just unnecessary. It is a mild insult to the divine. It is the equivalent of putting a safety net under a tightrope walker who you have just publicly announced cannot fall. And yet, there is a counter-tradition within Catholic thought, quieter but equally old, called stewardship theology. The idea is straightforward. If you have been entrusted with something irreplaceable, the failure to protect it is itself a moral failure. The Vatican archives hold documentation spanning 12 centuries. The Apostolic Library contains manuscripts that exist nowhere else on earth. The physical continuity of the papacy represents an unbroken institutional thread reaching back through nearly 2,000 years of human history. Letting that burn, if burning could be prevented, starts to look less like faith and more like negligence dressed up in religious language. Stewardship theology does not resolve the tension. It just gives the concrete and the ventilation shafts a more dignified name. The deeply human thing, the thing that makes the Vatican's alleged bunker feel less scandalous and more quietly touching, is that every single person who has ever bought insurance has made this exact negotiation. You believe things will probably be fine. You also pay a monthly premium in case they are not. These two positions coexist in your mind without visible distress, because what you have actually decided is that faith and precaution are not opposites. They are a married couple who have agreed not to discuss certain topics at dinner. Somewhere in the Vatican's institutional consciousness, someone made a similar peace with this a long time ago. What is remarkable is not that the church built a refuge. What is remarkable is that the church, which has counseled billions of people through grief and fear and the particular terror of non-existence, turns out to be afraid of the same things its parishioners are. Afraid that the work will not survive. Afraid that the thread will be cut. Afraid that something built across 2 millennia, something fragile and vast and irreplaceable, could simply stop. That fear is not a failure of faith. It is evidence of how much any of it meant in the first place. Imagine the particular loneliness of being responsible for an institution that cannot afford to end. The Pope is, by doctrine, the vicar of Christ. He is also a man, generally elderly, sleeping in a bed in a building that has survived sieges and sacks and the particular chaos of Renaissance Italian politics. At some point, someone who loved the church enough to worry about it walked down a corridor, looked at everything accumulated over centuries and thought, we should have a plan. That thought is not cynicism. It is the most devoted thing imaginable. Augustine bought time before his conversion. The Vatican, apparently, bought concrete. Neither act invalidated what came after. Both acts said the same thing. This matters enough to protect, even imperfectly, even at the cost of some theological tidiness. The bunker, confirmed or not, is not a crack in the Vatican's faith. It is an expression of it. A very loud, very underground expression sealed behind doors that could survive a nearby detonation, but an expression nonetheless. What it does not answer is who planned it when the decision was made, and what exactly was deemed worth saving when the moment came to choose. Somewhere beneath the Apostolic Palace, if the engineers and the archivists and the quietly nervous security consultants are to be believed, a generator is running right now. Not loudly. Generators of that quality do not announce themselves. They hum at a frequency just below conscious attention, the way refrigerators do, the way the human body does. You would not hear it standing in St. Peter's Square, looking up at the facade in the afternoon light. You would not hear it during Mass beneath the organ and the choir and the particular acoustic warmth of a building that has been collecting human breath for centuries. But it would be there. Patient. Purposeful. Indifferent to the beauty above it. Concrete does not care that it is beneath marble. That is, in some ways, its finest quality. Every civilization that has ever lasted long enough to worry about not lasting has built some version of this. The Egyptians buried their sacred objects in chambers the desert itself was supposed to forget. The British Crown moved its most irreplaceable documents out of London in September of 1939, before the bombs had even started falling, because someone calculated that hope is not a preservation strategy. The United States built Raven Rock and Mount Weather not because American democracy lacked faith in its own survival, but because the people who loved that democracy most were also paying close attention to geopolitical reality. Planning for the worst is not pessimism dressed in military clothing. It is the oldest form of reverence. You protect what you love. You protect it before you need to, which is the only time protection actually works. The question no civilization has ever answered cleanly is what you choose to take with you into the shelter. That choice, made under pressure in a corridor, probably at an inconvenient hour, is the most honest self-portrait any institution ever produces. It says, "This is what we decided was irreplaceable. This is what we decided was us." Whatever is humming beneath 121 acres of the world's most visited sacred ground, it was chosen. Deliberately, quietly, by people whose names we will almost certainly never know, working in a tradition of careful, faithful preparation stretching back through every frightened institution that ever loved something enough to bury it safely. Nobody will confirm it is there. Nobody needs to. The hum continues regardless, indifferent to acknowledgement, doing exactly what it was built to do, keeping something alive in the dark, against all the possibilities, against the full weight of history pressing down from above, steady and patient and utterly unwilling to stop.